the two biggest killer use cases of blockchain technology has been Bitcoin and stablecoins. And those are the two that are probably the most freedom money related, in the sense that they're actually solving people's problems outside of speculation. Fedwire literally settles $2 quadrillion a year in volume, and it does it with about the same number of transactions as Bitcoin.
Bitcoin's future is at a crossroads. As adoption accelerates and institutional money floods in, are we losing sight of what made Bitcoin revolutionary in the first place? Lyn Alden takes a deep dive into the ongoing debate. Should Bitcoin evolve to prioritize mass adoption, or should it remain the immutable, censorship-resistant store of value it was designed to be? With discussions around scaling, protocol changes, and even potential threats to decentralization, the stakes have never been higher. Could we see major updates to Bitcoin's core technology, or will resistance from the community hold them back? This conversation is a must-watch for anyone invested in Bitcoin's future. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Should Bitcoin change, or should it remain untouched? Let's get into it.
I think I'll start by saying what are the actions they take to sell their SOL for number go up. I think it's maybe correct to say some people are almost all focused on number go up rather than say freedom money as a narrative. But what actions are they taking to prevent that from happening? Is that be kind of my main pushback or main question for that topic?
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think that there's some deep state equivalent of Bitcoin conspiracy theory, that's some evil entity for Bitcoin. But I do worry that number go up is such a powerful motive. And at this price in this market cap, what makes number go up is big entities, big financial institutions and nation states. And I think that could be in conflict with this kind of soul of Bitcoin, where maybe it's more about, non-custodial use cases or scaling Bitcoin with potential changes to the protocol that may, could undermine its security because you're changing it or adding things, like privacy. I think that to me is a little bit scary. And that's actually what caused me, when I asked you that question about burnout a little bit earlier, I'm like, oh man, have we kind of lost the plot here?
Yeah, I would separate the burnout I went through was pretty different than what I think of overall Bitcoin. I think for me, it was just kind of running at full speed for a number of years in a rather crazy environment and then trying to kind of right size some of that. For Bitcoin in general, I think there's a couple verticals there. One is from the beginning, there's been a divergent economic view on basically store of value versus medium of exchange. And the store of value argument is basically saying that until people have a large cash balance in something, they usually don't even want to accept that thing. And so that basically the argument is that except for in cases where someone specifically needs it, that store of value is going to appeal to more people earlier on than medium of exchange. Or another way to say that is more people have a store of value problem than a medium of exchange problem, especially in the developed world, which is where the majority of capital is. And that's not to say that there's not a lot of people with a medium of exchange problem. I mean, one of the first use cases for Bitcoin was, to donate to entities when they get cut off from PayPal and others. And so that's been in place from the beginning. But I think that basically medium of exchange, and we see this across blockchains, even other blockchains where there's maybe more activity, it's still often not a lot of medium of exchange. It's more like trading and things like that and speculation. And so I think that medium of exchange activity comes generally later when, one, people have more cash balances in it, and two, the volatility is less. And that generally happens through adoption. And so that's kind of the one thing is obviously the one part was trying to emphasize medium of exchange earlier, and the other part was basically fine with the store of value generally coming first. And I think the other challenge is that generally speaking, there's not sustained fees on Bitcoin. So there's been spikes of high fees. And then especially in the current environment where there'd be kind of new things developed and they would use the blockchain for other purposes. They'd have this brief period of super high fees, and then they go back to not having fees. So when the question is, how can we scale this more? I think it tends to fall on deaf ears when people will say, well, I'm looking at the blockchain and I don't see a scaling problem because I can send Bitcoin for almost free. Now, if you were to get enough people where even to store value becomes hard because the number of people that want to pull from an exchange and hold it, if that alone starts creating a sustained fee environment, like if 10x more people are using Bitcoin than using it now for either mean of exchange or just because they want to hold some, that I think creates more incentives to update some of the protocol for scaling. And this generally one of the things we see in macro is there'll be a certain trend that things are on, and a lot of people will assume this trend is like inevitable and it's just going to keep happening like this. But then what happens is when that gets like too problematic for too many entities, that's when there's usually a very sudden change. So for example, before 2020, a lot of people were saying inflation is dead forever. There's no way to generate inflation. And it's like, well, if you print a ton of money and literally send it to people, you're going to make inflation. And so I think that I'm not that worried about Bitcoin because I think that it's not even really gone through the phase where it starts convincing more and more people that changes have to be made. And then the other phase I look at is that, for example, the leading discussions around different types of covenants or different types of script changes. And there's not even agreement among developers per se on which one to do and in what order before it even gets to less technical people in general. So I think it's natural that people are kind of concerned about that, and I think it's fully understandable. And I even think other blockchains throughout kind of the history of Bitcoin, they've allowed the market to have a couple different shots to see, okay, what does the market actually want? Do they want something that's got super high throughput, but then, you can't really audit it yourself? Do you want something that's very expressive, but maybe less decentralized? And I think right now the two biggest killer use cases of blockchain technology has been Bitcoin and stablecoins. There's other areas as well, but I think those are the two biggest, and those are the two that are probably the most freedom money related in the sense that they're actually solving people's problems outside of speculation. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk about other aspects of that, but.
Okay. Yeah. You mentioned so many things that I want to touch on here. Like the visual that I essentially have is very similar to kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's like the very bottom base layer is, humans need their basic physiological needs. In Bitcoin, that's like making sure, we don't increase the block size because it becomes more difficult and centralizes the network. We maintain the censorship resistance. And then, you start building the network around Bitcoin, you start making the money. And eventually you kind of reach this like top part of the pyramid, which, in Maslow's hierarchy, it's like self-actualization. It's this like pursuit of your higher purpose, like the sense of creativity. I think what you're kind of saying is like, maybe we're still traversing up that pyramid where there's not a need yet to have this like Bitcoin actualization, this monetary actualization of like medium of exchange or more expressivity, because the level of adoption hasn't quite yet hit. I guess, one question I have here is at what level of adoption would you kind of see, like, do you have some sort of metric where you say, oh, once X percentage of the world is on Bitcoin, then maybe it makes sense to start looking at some of these, different changes to Bitcoin to increase the scalability. And if there's not a level of adoption that we need to hit, and maybe instead your position is what you alluded to, where, well, there's no congestion on the chain, therefore we don't need to make any changes. Do you think there's any merit to me saying, well, that's because if we have no form of expressivity, no form of programmability of Bitcoin, then there's really no need to actually use the Bitcoin layer one. So it's kind of like, it's a reductive argument to say, hey, it's only 1 sat per VBuy right now, so why would we scale? When it's like, well, that's because you literally can't do any sort of programmability on Bitcoin. But if you could, then we would see sats per VBuy, at the 500 plus range. So do either of those two questions kind of resonate?
Yeah, I think the first part I would say it's always good to be exploring future things. You don't want to like start developing scaling solutions after you have congestion. It's just like I think congestion is what increases the urgency of users to push for those changes. I think there's multiple things, just like scaling should be explored, privacy should be explored, even quantum resilience should be explored, so that all these things are really well studied, so that when it comes time to various potential activations, these are not like new concepts. These are things that are very fleshed out over long periods of time, sometimes tested on other blockchains, sometimes just, around in BIP form and reviewed multiple times and discussed. So I certainly am glad that people are looking at all those things. And even I can fully see why people are in favor of activation now for some of those things, especially some of the maybe the less controversial ones, where people see that there's fewer arguments of harm. And I think that the total addressable market for Bitcoin, even just as money, is so big. Like Fedwire is the biggest settlement system in the Western world. I don't have the current Chinese numbers for what their settlement system's like, but the Fedwire literally settles $2 quadrillion a year in volume, and it does it with about the same number of transactions as Bitcoin. It's kind of like oddly close on that front. And of course, the way it does is that every transaction is like massive. So it does, like, say, rough numbers, 200 million transactions a year, average 5 million transaction size. Now, of course, Fedwire is a permissioned, closed, centralized system. And so basically, Bitcoin is this decentralized, permissionless, essentially version of Fedwire. And it would be problematic if it gets eventually so congested that only, 6-figure or 7-figure equivalent transactions make sense. That basically prices out a lot of people. And so you want ways to either build on top of it, sometimes custodially, sometimes non-custodially. There's multiple kind of trade-offs for all those. Maybe we could discuss. And so I think it makes sense. I mean, there are even people like Jameson Lopp that talk about how, even the block size shouldn't be completely off limits in a discussion. And I think that nothing's really off limits. People might argue that the increase in the block size wasn't fundamentally the issue. It was trying to increase it by that much, that early, and not having consensus. And the immutability and the auditability was really important. But maybe when 15 years from now, when processors are better and storage is better and bandwidth is better, maybe a slight block size increase would make sense. So, there's multiple things from covenants to block size to, they might even have to do that kind of thing if there's ever a need for quantum resilience. It might just take more block space to make, signatures that are resilient, that kind of thing. That's not really my area of expertise. So I certainly think that all things should be on the table for discussion. And then it comes down to what is the reason they're not activated now? Is anyone actively holding it back? And are enough people focused on it? And I'm pretty happy with the state of the network, but I fully get why other people are experiencing more urgency in terms of wanting some of these changes faster.